been otherwise.
Okay, we'll start off then with the second session of the day, which is the poetic session. So we'll start with William Rowe, and the official blurb of William. William is currently Professor of Poetics at Birkbeck College, founder and until recently Director of the Contemporary Poetics Research Centre, again in Birkbeck. His recent poetry includes The Earth Has Been Destroyed, which is Veer, Nation, Clinaman, and I believe there's potentially a third volume of stuff being worked on. He's the editor of The Salt Guide to Bill Griffiths. He's the author of 3 lyric poets, Lee Howard, Barry Sweeney, Chris Torrance, and a member of the Veer Books editorial group. William is currently working on The Books of Bill Griffiths, an introduction to his poetry. William doesn't need any introduction to most people here, I think, as, again, one of the most important people in the British poetry scene, I think. That's completely aside from his stature as a very important international poetry of Spanish, or professor, I should say, of Spanish poetry, which he very modestly doesn't mention here. But, anyway, without much further ado, William Rowe.
Yeah. We need you right. I think there's one person who had a longer version of this talk. This I hope is sharper and poses the question in a way that we can't answer, which is what I'm aiming at. Next slide. So the classical leftist critique of the commodity, which, as Marshall McLuhan said, is what you put on. You don't get into a car, you wear it. Is to say that the car's shiny appearance conceals the workers and the factory. But I want to talk about 3 poets who refuse that approach and do something different, and what that might have to do with how we understand the commodity. So first of all, Upham's car. Karl Marx famously wrote, the commodity is the cell of bourgeois society, not the prison cell, but the, I guess, biological cell. And that the way it manifests itself can be called fetishism. And obviously the scene in Psycho where a car is slurped into the water and disappears, that's a kind of representation of the fetishism of the car. So I'm going to begin with a poem by George Oppen because it raises the question of what we do with the commodity, in this case a car, how we use it, and how that relates to how it might be understood. Next slide. Upham's poem enters the same terrain as Marx's Capital, but it does so in the way that poetry does characteristically with more compression and more speed. It's from a book called Discrete Series, 1932-1934, and the key lines are these ones. Nothing can equal in polish and obscured origin that dark instrument, a car. So of course, nothing can equal prepares you for some sort of sublime revelation. And then the word nothing, and what that nothing actually might be, is delayed by 3 more words, that dark instrument. Obscured origin sounds like an essence that's going to be revealed. But the poem halts briefly in the middle of the phrase. A crack opens up, a resistance. To what? To what I've just mentioned, to the image of the dignity of labour, which was a commonplace, of course, of the 1930s. Upham's phrase, polish and obscured origin, makes the car's shiny appearance and its hidden origin into apparent opposites. The shine causes the origin to disappear. But what follows doesn't give us the revelation we were made to wait for. At that point, there's a strong typographical break, a calm, which ease the hand on the sword hilt. So you get a line break, a typographical empty space, a parenthesis. So a further sense of what this thing is offered, but it stops in mid-air, just offering the gesture of definition, which, without content, the gesture in mid-air failing, Why can't it go on? After all, the commodity is an equivalence, and famously, as John Locke said in the 18th century, the value of any commodity is expressed by another commodity. No problem. The sawtilt implies the gear lever. The car, in the act of driving it, becomes an instrument, a weapon of death. This is why Oppen doesn't go on to represent living labour, the hands that made the car. This which hangs in the air and gets closed down by a full stop at the point at which ease enters. Easiness, ease the gear stick. A concealed weapon? Certainly, explanation fails or falls in the face of this instrumentality of the car, which says nothing about actual work in the factory, but does say something about social antagonism. So here's the difficulty of representing labour, something that American social poetry of the 30s had no trouble with. Oppen does. And to put it simply, his difficulty is with the shine of the car, how it obscures and what it obscures. Marx's theory does say what the thing that's obscured is. And it's abstract labour or labour power, extracted and taken away from workers in such a way that they get back less than they give. So an inherent social violence. But something strange and crucial happens just at the point when you think this problem through, or try to, theoretically. Doing it doesn't give you an image, a representation. Trying to grasp abstract labour doesn't give you an image. You slip back into picturing the car factory, the machines, the workers that made the car, as if that was all there was to it. When you do something like take the gear stick, that the image of the workers fails. Ideology rests upon what we do. You know the car was made by workers, but when you put your hand on the gear stick, and it's not that bad capitalists have hidden the image of work, that's social democracy. You slip back into picturing the work in the factory until you get your hand on the gear lever again and it repeats itself. The poem repeats itself. Until when? So the hidden thing in Oppen's poem isn't the workers, but something else it can't say. And it can't say it because of the commodity, because of the polish, the shine. So polish and obscure origin, as well as being opposites, meaning the shininess hides where the colours come from, is also saying that somehow they're the same thing. The polish is the obscured origin. At that point, we can think that the shine of the car is actually coming from abstract labour, yet the social violence that that carries has actually migrated to something else, using your car as a weapon. Social interaction. We can't grasp it, we can only grasp the gear lever. So what Marx has claimed to be a core component of the commodity actually slips away. It isn't shown for what it is, but only as a transferred shine. Transferred, but also actual. This is precisely where the concept of the commodity as a fetish steps in. This is a way of thinking about commodities as representations. What I'm suggesting, though, is that the poem does something which this theory of fetishism doesn't quite do. It places before us, in lived time, the point or the moment at which the fetish appears and then disappears. So I'm suggesting Oppen's poem shows how a certain way of relating to Marx's idea of commodity as fetish actually doesn't quite work. It is a representation, but as soon as you grab hold of it, it isn't, and it falls away. So fetishism in Marxist theory comes to name a thing that's part of the commodity, but is not represented, or is, but only as a fetish. This way of thinking is supported by the historical use of the word fetish. It comes out of a situation in which representing commodities was problematic. Portuguese colonial traders in the 16th century had problems with the Africans they were trading with. The Africans didn't understand commercial value and were resistant to the proper notion of trading. In this situation, the European idea of the fetish object came to fill the gap of mutual misperception. This word fetish comes from the Portuguese feitiço, which means an act or object of witchcraft. This word came to explain the apparent fact that Africans valued objects to which they attributed special powers, like the word charms, worn on the body, but which to the European mentality were arbitrary and empty of proper significance. In the formation of the fetish as an idea in the colonial context, theology had to be brought in, because the Africans treated as sacred things that were not properly that to the European mentality. The European term for misuse of the sacred is idolatry. You worship the wrong object, but your attitude is legitimate because you're worshipping it. The problem with the fetish is it's not worth worshipping, and what you're doing with it isn't worship either, so it falls out of proper theology. It's well known that Marx uses the idea of religion to explain commodities, so what I've pointed out is that has a colonial history. His position is that the social relations of production appear as a relation between things, a relation between commodities. The shine or appearance or show of the commodity has nothing to do with its physical properties. So the word fetishism comes in to do the conceptual work. Fetishism is a name for what Marx calls the phantom-like objectivity of the commodity. The argument which leads to the use of the word phantom begins from what happens when we disregard the use value of commodities. Only one property remains, that of being products of labour, still quoting Marx, but not specific acts of work, rather human labour in the abstract turned into capital. In this process, all the specific sensuous characteristics of the product of labour are extinguished. It's merely there to be exchanged. So, next slide, there's something suprasensible or mysterious about it. If we now look at the residue of the products of labour, there's nothing left in them, in each case, but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labour. The word congealed actually comes from the word gelatin in German, as Keston Sutherland pointed out recently. So there's the notion of extracting from flesh a glue, which will then make objects of consumption. Next slide. So Marx bringing religion in. In religion, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own. So it is in the world of commodities, as in the products of man's hands. I call this the fetishism of the century. So an impasse of representation in early colonialist empire turns into another impasse of representation in the contemporary world. Now for some more poetry. Of course, Marx's work on the commodity is a verbal fiction, and he thought of capital as a work of literature. So we are already in the terrain of poetics when reading Marx. Most aesthetically conservative poetry subordinates itself to the commodity form. Next slide. So the sonnet Shipping Forecast by Seamus Heaney, the words of the shipping forecast conjure, his word, the things. Obviously, conjury was associated with witchcraft, and we're brought back into that terrain of magical production. But what does Heaney do with it? Here we have the trawlers sheltering in the gale. L'Étoile, le Guillemot, la Belle Hélène nursed their bright names this morning in the bay. Name, object, name. This is rather like money, commodity money in Marx. From the name to the thing and back to the name, which the poem calls marvellous and makes the word haven echo with heaven. But it is a mystification. No cognizance is taken of the relation of naming to space, to commerce, to the effect of the world of commodities on all things. At this point, we are excluded from the poem because it's a privileged club called poetry, where things like commodities actually don't exist. I want to move to two early 20th century poets, Gertrude Stein and Cesar Vallejo, who both, I think, oppose the commodity in different ways, and very interestingly different ways. Stein's Tender Buttons, next slide, came out in 1914. I'm sorry about the bottom bit, it just fell off. What's the disposition of things in this book? How are they handled and grasped? An approximation would be to say that objects exist as displacements of space, which is to say they are nothing like objects are for John Locke, for whom they are bundles of qualities or properties that can be shifted about at will, like a manager behind his desk. Things in Tender Buttons seem to exist as a displacement in the medium in which they are, like objects which displace water or objects in a Bill Viola video. In other words, as if objects affect each other through the physical medium. But that's the first approximation. It's true that objects in Tender Buttons exist in a spatial medium that creates a resistance, and which prevents the easy sliding, the easy equivalence between words and things we found in Heaney. Words are also affected by space in Stein. But what type of space is it? Next slide. No. Back to the previous one, sorry. This is the one that falls off the bottom. Yeah. Roast beef is the title of this piece. The change, the dirt. Not to change dirt means that there is no beefsteak, and not to have that is no obstruction. It is so easy to exchange meaning. It is so easy to see the difference. The difference is that a plain resource is not entangled with thickness. We begin with change and dirt, and then that for there to be beef, it depends on changing dirt. So an interdependence of things. But what type of relation are we talking about? When we get to not to have that is no obstruction, what's happening is that negation, not to have that, doesn't get in the way of existence of things in space, or the entry of space into the relation between words. Not to change is no obstruction. So that we have change and dirt, things in movement, they don't obstruct each other. And what follows comes like an explanation. It is so easy to exchange meaning. It is so easy to see the difference. But what type of exchange? There's an obvious meaning. Things can only be exchanged if seen as different. But in the sentence that follows, the difference is that a plain resource is not entangled with thickness, where we get abstracted visual qualities, like in a cubist painting, of plainness and of thickness. These are not entangled with each other. If we think of cubism, they are intersecting and passing through each other, like a table, a newspaper, a bottle, a violin, and so on in Picasso, Rowe, or Greece. There's a specific pleasure of objects in Tender Buttons, a strong sense of freedom. Things are there for themselves, traversing space, taking up space, and they're not for exchange. It is so easy to exchange meaning, yet the meanings do not square up. They don't face each other as equivalences. Now I go on. Every time that is languid, there is that there, then, and not often, not always, not particular, tender and changing and external and central and surrounded and singular and simple and the same and the surface and the circle and the shine and the sucker and the white and the same and the better and the red and the same and the center and the yellow and the tender and the better and all together. There's no telling then at what point the negative becomes affirmative and vice versa. The writing doesn't seem to have a sense of time passing through it as it did in Oppen. There seems to be a complete presence all the time, nothing not presented. The factor of non-negation goes with the absence of time. And of course, time is the dimension of labour and of production. There's a sense of freedom to it, a utopian sidestepping of history. The absence of existential time means that historical time is kept out. What I would like to suggest is this utopia is not to be abandoned to some rather shallow criticism, but simply taken further. Now finally to the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo, next slide. The poem I'm going to quote was published in 1922 in a book called Trilce. Vallejo hadn't read Stein, but he had read Dada poetry. But the poem begins with a strong opposition between, on the one hand, disjunctive poetics of Dada, and on the other hand, French symbolism. In fact, the poem retraces how, historically, the early 20th century avant-gardes, especially Dadaism, changed the field. But as we'll see, the poem also shows the limitations of the disjunctive poetics associated with Dadaism. Actually, next one, sorry, that's wrong. That's it. Saman would say, the air is calm and of a contained sadness. Vallejo says, today death is welding every border to every strand of lost hair, from the dish of a frontal bone where there's seaweed, lemon balm, singing sacred mastic trees on guard, and empty antiseptic poems without owner. Saman was a Belgian symbolist poet, and Vallejo quotes a poem about a hospice. Here's some of it. The golden leaves fall slowly like memories on the grass. So Saman in his poem slows time down, and the words seem to become full of the things they refer to. Vallejo speeds things up by joining everything, but the things he is joining are disjoined. So first we get the symbolist aesthetic, harmonious music, joining words to things, things to things, and both together. The space it makes is produced by selection, selecting only those objects of social experience that go smoothly together. Harmony is the counterpart of exchange, the form taken by it. Then comes Vallejo's own writing. Pure disjunction shatters the harmony. No universal equivalent here. What's going on is that the limits of things are frontiers that place them in relation to other things, and that welds them together. We've already moved beyond purely disjunctive poetics. Death welds. It's the force that brings things into conjunction that Vallejo draws attention to. This is different from the way things exist in Stein's Tender Buttons. And if Vallejo's poem still relates to Cubist planes of intersection, the intersections are violent. The word containing the richness of the thing is finished, because now things are emptied by the very force that joins them. Death welds. This is industrial time. But it's not the image of machines and sweating workers. On the contrary, it's something without an image, something with death inside it, something like dead labour. If we read the rest of the poem, we find that the symbolist fullness of the thing is annulled, whether by the logic of the hospital, part of the state, as administration of death, or by the logic of industrial time, and that both are the same. This is Marxian time, the labour that went into the commodity. On the next slide. Death is welding. It's an industrial process. The whole symbolist tradition is being unwritten. So here's the ending of the poem. A patient is reading the news, like on a lectern. Another one is lying, throbbing, long-faced, near enough buried. And I notice one shoulder's in its place still, and is almost ready after this one on the other side. And the afternoon has passed 16 times through the patrolled subsoil, and there's almost complete absence in the yellow wooden number of the bed that's been empty such a long time over there in front. I suggest that Vallejo is taking Mallarmé's absence further. In Vallejo, the thing is made into absence by the hospital, by the industrial time, by police reality, shown from his phrase, and not simply by the word that takes its place. Death is welding. Every limit is a frontier, not an inert boundary. The thing's relation to its other is also given inside itself. Agreed, in Gertrude Stein, the boundaries of things are not inert in the sense that things and qualities intersect. But in Stein, they don't affect each other. But Vallejo's poem is even more deeply opposed to itself. It takes the force of disjuncture and juncture, then throws the angelic realm of absolute knowledge against it. Today, death is welding every border to every strand of lost hair. Here's the gaze of God, for whom every strand on your hair is counted, but the very hairs on your head are all counted. So the absolute is brought back from the realm of mystery into history. But to what purpose? This absolute gaze leaves nothing out. It includes all that's excluded by verbal fictions, all that's not included in history. And this includes abstract labour. Note that abstract labour, what's abstracted from the worker, is her or his life. It doesn't mean unreal, quite the opposite. And the afternoon has passed 16 times through the patrolled subsoil. This is the other side of spectacular time, which is time that can be consumed as a commodity. Numeration without sum is here thrown against the police reality of the state. It's the unrepresented. The state counts everything, and against that counting, the poem articulates the crawling cinematic time of the optical unconscious as we move from the newspaper to the camera and finally to the unnumbered, what's missing from the empty bed. What's uncounted is the time of dying, which precisely makes present the otherwise obscured abstract labour. The other number, the yellow wooden number over the empty hospital bed, counts nothing but death. That's the absence of the body. Absent or subtracted from what? From the state's representations that assemble reality, and therefore from language, that way round. Thank you.